love our enemies. But God doesn't change. His way of dealing with mankind changes. In the Old Testament and the New, they're different. God himself has not changed. He is the author of life. He is holy, and he will be respected in his holiness. Okay. Who was the first dead person in the Bible? There's a picture that represents it in a way, artistically. The first dead person, the person to die physically, Abel, killed by his brother Cain. Now, this picture represents a stone, like he hit him with a stone, and that's probably what he did, but there's no way of knowing. The Bible doesn't say how Abel died. But after Abel died, and from that point on, death is common in the Scripture. Then there's the flood. Those that study these things say that, I'm just going to No, I can't just hold it. So hold on a second while I... People who count things like this, it's turned off. Why am I recording? The people who count things like this say that how many people would you say they estimate died in the flood? Have you seen any figures about this? I had no idea. I just saw this. Somebody had estimated. In the thousands, would you say? In the millions? Well, okay. Well, maybe the billions. The estimate that I found was 7 million, up to 7 million people, possibly. A lot of people. The numbers really are not important. The plagues. Now, where's Wendell? Wendell's not here this morning. He's out of town. All right. Wendell has just taught us in Exodus about the plagues. And those plagues, well, when I was learning these stories growing up, and even older when I was grown up, I usually considered that the only deaths in these plagues were in the last one, the death of the firstborn. But when Wendell was up here talking, and I was reading through those descriptions again, when you look at, well, there's the death of the livestock in 5. When you look at the hail and the fire and the flies and the gnats for people who had pulmonary problems, and all kinds of stuff like that, hail and fire, that sounds like some people might have died during that time. It would be conceivable. The water turned to blood seems to have only lasted a week, but the text doesn't say necessarily that it only lasted a week. It just says that he went back in to see Pharaoh after the water had been blood for a week. But imagine in a country the size of Egypt, even at the time when there was no water anywhere. Some people might have died from that too. So what I'm saying is there was death all through this, and there was death caused by plagues. But the Egyptians weren't the only ones who suffered from plagues. In the history of Israel, when they were wandering in the desert, first of all, they got to a point several times, more than once anyway, they got to a point where they started complaining, why did we leave Egypt? Why don't we go back there? Why are you bringing us all out here where we have nothing to eat and nothing really good? And so at one point God said, I've had enough, and he sent fiery serpents. I assume that means venomous serpents among them. And they complained to God about that. Why are you doing this? And so then God had Moses set up what we call another serpent, a copper serpent on a pole, and that they were supposed to then look at that. When they were bitten, they were supposed to look at that, and they would be healed. I had also thought that there were a lot of them set up in the desert, but no, apparently the text says only one. One serpent that was lifted up in the desert, and the people who were bitten by the fiery serpents were to look at that, and they would be healed. Jesus mentions that in his ministry. To whom? As the serpent was lifted up, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so the Son of Man will be lifted up. Who's he talking to when he says that? Nicodemus. We usually miss that because there are some other passages in that chapter 3 to Nicodemus of John that are so important that we pass over that expression of Jesus where he refers to this incident in the Old Testament. But anyway, There were many people, that's my point on this one, many people died in the plagues at that point. And then, at one point, the children of Israel got involved with the gods of Moab and their gods, that is a very licentious kind of adoration. And a certain man by the name of Phinehas, when he saw an Israelite man bring a Moabite woman into his tent, he went into the tent and slew them both, killed them both. And the text says, now this is kind of graphic, the text says, the ESV anyway, he pierced both of them through her belly. Another translation says through her body. That's how close they were, right, in the tent. He killed them both with one stroke, apparently. And God blessed that man because he was jealous for the Lord, because he had seen how Israel was going to the gods of the Moabites. And this man who had done this, what we consider an awful thing, was blessed by the Lord for being jealous for the purity of his people. Interesting story. On one occasion then, also you have that third one up there, David, who had ordered a census, a numbering of Israel, when he wasn't authorized to do so, was being punished by God, who offered him 3 possibilities. 3 years of famine, 3 months of flight before your enemies, or 3 days of pestilence. Which would you have picked? Which would I have picked? What a choice that David had to pick. For his own sin, the people had to be punished. And look at that, 70,000 men. From Dan to Beersheba. Dan to Beersheba is a way of saying from top to bottom of Israel, 70,000 men, we're not counting women, we're not counting children, died from the plague. So there were plagues, which took a lot of people. Then there is childbirth. We all know of a famous case of a woman who died in childbirth in the Old Testament. What was her name? Rachel was her name. Who was the child? Benjamin, Jacob's last child. Now, Rachel wanted to call him Benoni, which meant son of my sorrow. Jacob overruled and said, we're going to call him Benjamin, which means son of my strength. I think in the circumstance, Jacob should have given in to her. She was the one paying the price. Let her name this boy. That's just an aside, that's free. But she died in childbirth. I looked for some other examples, and I only found one. There might be more, but I found this one too. Oh, there's Rachel, sorry. And then I found this one too, the wife of Phinehas. Now, not the Phinehas I just talked about, who killed the Moabite woman and her Israeli lover. This is Phinehas, who was the son of Eli, who was a judge in Israel. Eli, we'll talk about him later. He was a bad judge. Phinehas and Hophni, his sons, were bad people, bad priests. God had told Eli, your sons are going to die in battle. Well, they're going to die. I don't think he said in battle. They're going to die on the same day. That's what he said in 1 Samuel 2. And so when Hophni and Phinehas went out to fight the Philistines, this was in the battle where the Philistines took the ark away from Israel. When the wife of Phinehas heard that her husband had died, she was due. The pains came upon her. She died giving birth, and she named this child before she died. Now, get ready for this. She named this child Ichabod. For Americans, Ichabod is a kind of a silly name, isn't it? Ichabod Crane, right? The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Ichabod Crane. What woman will call her child in America? Do you know any Ichabods? I don't know any. See, it's almost funny for Ichabod. It just sounds funny. But it was a very serious name because it means no glory. And this woman said, the glory has gone out of Israel, and I'm going to call this child because the Philistines have taken the ark, and my husband has died in that battle. There is no glory in Israel, and so she called her child Ichabod. But she died in childbirth. Does anybody know of any other example in the Bible of death in childbirth? I looked, but I didn't do an exhaustive search, but I didn't see anything else. Okay. Here is the big one. The big one. More people died by the sword than by any other means in the Old Testament, in the Bible. There's an enormous number of deaths that are recorded due to the sword. Now, in the ESV, if you use the ESV and you have the word slaughtered, Somebody was slaughtered. That usually means by the sword, but not necessarily. So here are some examples specifically mentioning death by sword. This one we know really well. I want to point out something to you that I discovered just as I was finishing up preparations for today. You remember Brother Higginbotham told us, no, look at the text again, slow down. All right? So when we look at Goliath, here's what we see. David hit him with a stone, he fell down. I used to think that's what killed him. And then he went over and he cut off his head, and that killed him. I mean, later I thought he killed him when he cut off his head. But the text doesn't say that. You know what the text says? The text says, David prevailed over the Philistine. This is 1 Samuel 17. I got it up there? Yeah. Prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. Struck and killed. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, now he explains. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head. Killed him and cut off his head. Now, normally in English grammar, that means he did two things. He killed him, then he cut off his head. I looked at other translations, they all say that. I looked at the Hebrew. I don't read Hebrew, but I've got a comparison thing, and it showed that in the Hebrew it says, killed him and cut off his head. All right, so he killed him before he cut off his head. That's what it says, doesn't it? So he ran over. Here's what I see David doing. Ran over, grabbed that thing out of its sheath, and he did like this, like you see in the films. Check. Don't know if that's what he did, but he did something that killed him. And then he took that sword, and he cut off his head, and then he carried his head back, and you know the story. Goliath was killed with a sword. And that's probably the most famous sword death that we have in the Bible. Then we have Balaam. Balaam was a prophet whom Balak sort of tried to get to curse Israel. You know this story too. Balaam kept getting positive prophecies, and Balak kept saying, why don't you, I ask you to curse them if you are blessing them. He blessed them 3 times. He's the man whose donkey talked to him, remember that? In Numbers 22, I guess it is, and who beat his donkey because the donkey wouldn't go down this road where the angel of the Lord was standing and he couldn't see it. So anyway, Balaam was killed by the sword, along with some other people in the Midianite camp when Israel was fighting with Midian. Balaam apparently wasn't all that nice a guy. Then, during the conquest of Canaan, you read a lot of stories about how people were killed by the sword when Joshua and his men took a city and that sort of thing. Then there's a story of Ehud. Ehud was a judge in Israel. And here's an interesting story. This is a kind of a grotesque story. When Ehud became the judge, Moab was ruling them, and the king of Moab's name was Eglon. I guess that's how you would say that. And the Bible says he was a very fat man. So Ehud went to him. Moab had been dominating Israel for many years. This judge needed to get out from under this domination. So he went to see this guy and he said, I have a secret message for you. And so Eglon invited Ehud into his private chambers. And what happened? Okay, here's the secret message. Judges 3, 21, 22. Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh. Now it was a 1 cubic meter sword, okay, about that, double-edged. Reached over and took it from his right thigh. And the text says he plunged it, thrust it into his belly. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade. For he did not pull the sword out of his belly, left it there. And here's the grotesque part. The dung came out. The man was really slaughtered. I mean, Ehud had done with one stroke, he had really killed this guy. Then the text said that since the doors were closed to the other quarters, The servants thought he was probably in there sleeping. Meantime, the man who had killed Eglon closed the doors on the other side and was gone, long gone by the time the servants got tired of waiting for him to come out, and they went in and found him there. So there's a graphic story of death by sword. And it was done to relieve Israel of their domination by the Moabites. Abimelech. If you see any details in any of these you want to point out that I'm not pointing out, feel free. Abimelech was the king of Israel. He was laying siege to a city, the city of Thebez. And there was a tower in the city, and there were people that were up in the tower, and he was besieging this tower, and one lady, a woman, threw a millstone over and landed on Abimelech's head. Now it says a millstone. A millstone can weigh 2,000 or 3,000 pounds. So I looked into this and found it's also called an upper millstone, which probably means a part of the millstone. And maybe she had some help, but it was her doing it. And she launched this thing over the wall, and it landed on his head, and it crushed his skull, the text says. Now, he was apparently conscious enough to know he was going to die. Somebody told him it was a woman who did this. And he said, I don't want to die by the hands of a woman. So what did he do? We know the story, don't we? His sword bearer. He said, take your sword and thrust me through. Would you have the courage to do that? To tell somebody else to thrust you through? It took courage, but this was a bad man, but he did have that kind of bravery in battle. So his armor bearer thrust him through with his sword, and he died. Here's something we don't look at often. The prophets of Baal, 450 of them, when they are called to Mount Carmel for this confrontation that we all know about where the Lord brought fire down from heaven. The text says in the beginning there were also 400 prophets of Asherah, but they're not mentioned afterwards, so we don't know what happened to them, if what happened to the prophets of Baal happened to them also. But when this confrontation was over, all those prophets of Baal, 450, were seized, and the text says that Elijah slaughtered them. Probably not all by himself, but he had them slaughtered, and that's where the text probably means. Well, 1 Corinthians 19, 1 Kings 19, one that you have there, says by the sword. He used a sword. Okay, in a more general sense, Israel and Judah, the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah had threatened God's people with death by the sword if they were not faithful. And so when they were carried off in captivity, there was obviously a lot of death by the sword. In the New Testament, James, the brother of John, first apostle, was killed by Herod by the sword. He was probably beheaded. Some of these things are going to overlap. By the sword. Something I didn't put up there, and I hesitated, but I'm going to mention it. In the New Testament, when Herod killed a whole generation of 2-year-olds, 2 and under, you know, he probably did that by the sword. Okay? And then we have some of the greats of the Old Testament in Hebrews 11 that are said to have died by the sword. So it's a very prevalent means of death in the Old Testament. And we're going to be talking about decapitation too, so that involves the sword. So anything to say about that before we go? Now, isn't this awful? I mean, it's terrible to think about, but we need to think about the deaths that occurred in the Old Testament. I'm sort of laying the groundwork for something that's going to be a little bit easier to look at. But we do need to do this. I think we do. Anyway. All right, decapitation was not, I point out from the very beginning, was not something that God ever ordered anybody to do in Israel. This was not a capital punishment idea that God ordered. But some people were decapitated. For example, here, let me put these names up. Oreb and Zeb. Does that say something to you? Probably not. Gideon does, all right? Gideon and his victory with 300 men over the Midianites. After that battle, the Midianites were running, and Gideon's men were chasing them. And there were 2 princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, who were caught, and they were beheaded, and their heads were brought back to Gideon. Then, of course, there was the giant Goliath. We've seen that. He was decapitated. Then this story about Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth was the son of what famous Old Testament king? Saul. Saul was dead at this point, and some of David's men were sort of trying to eke out revenge on Saul's family. And so this guy had a sort of a bodyguard who were faithful to David, so they ambushed him, and they stabbed him, and then they cut off his head, and they brought the head to David. Now, David had a very bad reaction to this, because David said, this man was innocent. This is not Saul, this is his son. Why are you doing this? In fact, he had a bad reaction to the people that killed Saul, too. But anyway, he's saying, this was an innocent man. You had no reason to do this. And so what did he do to these people who brought him back the head of Ishbosheth? He killed them and had their hands and feet cut off and then hanged them. You believe that? That's what David did to the killers of Ishbosheth. And then, this is what all we'll have time for today, I suppose. There's the awful story of Jehu, I guess you say in English. Jehu. Jehu. He was a king in Israel. God established him as king, but he also established him as executioner. This man was an executioner, and God sent him. Now, what God told him was, I've got the passage here, we won't read it. It's in 2 Kings 9, verse 4. God tells Ahab, I want you to wipe out everything and everybody that has any sort of a connection with Ahab. I want you to take them all out. And that's what Ahab did. He went, first of all, and he killed Joram, the king of Israel, and Ahaziah, the king of Judah, who had relationships with Ahab. Then he killed Jezebel. We're going to talk about Jezebel later in unusual deaths, but how did he have her killed? How did she die? She was thrown out a window. Talk about an unusual way to die. But anyway, Jehu was the one who said, okay, are you with me? Toss her down. And she came down. And then the prophecy, of course, the dogs ate her bones, ate her body and so forth. Then he went after the sons of Ahab. Now, these sons had been sort of farmed out into different areas of Israel. And Jehu sent a letter to all these men who were raising the sons of Ahab and said, send their heads to me. Their heads. And they were all decapitated and brought to him in baskets. 70 sons, 70. And then Jehu went after all his great men, all his close friends, all his priests. And then he went after all who remained to Ahab. That's sort of the same thing. Then he went after the prophets and the worshipers of Baal. He even tricked them. Had them come to a great worship where they all gathered together. And then they were surrounded by 85 men of Jehu. And then they couldn't get out. The 85 men came in and killed them all. But not until Jehu had confirmed there were no worshipers of the Lord in that group. Got them all out. Then when he was sure it was only the people from Ahab who were worshiping Baal, then he had them all slaughtered. And then he burned the pillar and the house of Baal. So those aren't all decapitations, but the 70 sons of Ahab are. And that's to show you again that some of the awful things that happened. And this on the order of the Lord himself. Okay, let's talk about one more before we stop. We'll get started, but we won't finish. Any comments on what we've seen so far? All right, then there's Sheba. I forgot Sheba. Oh yeah, Sheba. He's a man that was a rebel against David. And he was decapitated by the people of a city. I think it was, in that story, Joab, who was sent out by David to take the city because this guy was in there, he was besieging, laying siege to the whole city. And a lady came out somehow or other and said, Joab, why are you destroying the city? You want one man? I'll give him to you. He said, okay, give him to me. She tossed his head over the wall. That was a tough lady. Somehow or other, she managed that. Okay, divine judgment. Sodom and Gomorrah are probably the first, divine judgment. I didn't talk about the flood, but after the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah are probably the first example of divine judgment. Now, a lot of people these days are saying, we should not blame, or we should not identify Sodom and Gomorrah with homosexual immorality. But the Bible does. It does say very clearly. In Jude, for example, you have that one up there. Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, it says, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, which is a biblical expression for homosexuality, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. That's interesting, eternal fire. Nadab and Abihu, we know that story. How those two priests introduced an unauthorized fire on the altar. God had sent a fire down for the altar. They brought one in from somewhere else, and this is not acceptable, and they were struck down by God on the spot. Now, have we ever noticed, and this will be the last thing we have time for, I guess, today, but have we ever noticed what God says to Aaron, their father, after that? He says in Leviticus 10, "This is what the Lord has said." This is Moses talking to Aaron. "Among those who are near me I will be sanctified, and before all the people I will be glorified." And Aaron held his peace. That means he didn't respond to that. "I will be glorified," God says. And then he says, "Drink no wine or strong drink, you or your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, lest you die. It will be a statute forever throughout your generations." I think those two guys were drunk when they went in there. They didn't even think about the fire on the altar. And God struck them down because of what they did, and then said, "Look, when you go into my temple, you will honor me, and you will not be drunk. I don't want my priests trying to serve me in a state of drunkenness." Okay, let's stop there. We have 2 minutes, but I think that's a good place to stop. Does anybody have anything they would like to add in conclusion? Jeremy. So Jeremy's saying that if they made movies of all these stories, they would be too gross to look at, or they would be inaccurate because people would be afraid to put all that on the screen. I don't know that they'd be afraid to put all that on the screen. I've seen some awful stuff on the screen. But I thought about that too. You could make some awful films out of all this stuff. And some have made some films, not so awful, I guess. They leave out the awful stuff. But yeah, this is awful stuff. This is grotesque stuff. This is hard to stomach. And I understand how you're probably feeling. Why is he doing this? But I'm going to continue next time. We're going to finish this before we get into more pleasant things to look at. So thank you for your comments. Thank you for your attention. We'll continue next week.